and then the data would get relayed to some cloud servers. And in the top corner here, you have a sort of wearable device, say a smartwatch or a Fitbit, which would, again, in this case, would talk to your smartphone, which kind of serves as the gateway, and the data again gets sent to the cloud. So if you look at these models, they're fairly centralized. I mean, you have the gateway as one central entity managing the small network, and then you have the cloud servers as a sort of overarching global central entity, right? And this sort of paradigm is certainly useful. It helps bootstrap IoT systems, but we are slowly seeing some issues here because by the fact that centralization helps us set this up fairly quickly, it also means these central entities are vulnerable, right? So if you can bring some of these central entities down, then very often the networks get disconnected, right? And very often you might even have two IoT devices sitting right next to each other. For all intents and purposes, they should be able to directly talk in an ad hoc manner, but the way things are set up, very often their data gets relayed through their corresponding cloud servers, right? Another side effect is the increasing vulnerability of IoT devices. A lot of this is attributed to the poor security measures in place and the fact that IoT manufacturers want to sort of get their products out into the market without giving a clear thought to the security practices. So an emerging example is the proliferation of botnets. So Mirai is probably one of the most well-known botnet. And this picture is sort of showing you the sort of typical attack model of these botnets, right? So they try to look for known vulnerabilities in various IoT devices. So this could include the fact that a lot of these devices just use default passwords, which means anyone can pretty much, if they know the port numbers, they could send sort of messages and get into these devices. And once these botnets infect one of these devices, then they look for other vulnerable IoT devices on the same network, infiltrate them, and they keep propagating. And of course, the goal, particularly with these botnets, is not necessarily just to target these individual devices, but then eventually launch a orchestrated denial of service attack on some potential targets. So a very sort of famous attack, one of the first and large-scale attacks that was launched through IoT devices is the attack on the Michael Krebs website. So Michael Krebs is a known security blogger, and this is a bit old, but these numbers have only increased, in fact. So someone actually launched an attack on his website, which created instantaneous traffic of up to 665 gigabytes per second. And this was launched through 145,000 hacked webcams, right? And more of these attacks are happening all the time. I mean, there's lots of instances of this continuing. Then you have some more serious attacks, right, where state actors may sort of exploit the fact that critical infrastructure like the power grid is actually connected to the internet, and they might exploit certain vulnerabilities that may be known to then bring down the power grid. And there are various suspected such attacks that have recently taken place in the US and various other countries. Another potential problem is the issue of data silos. So we know a lot of data is being collected, and more will be as we have increased IoT penetration. But there's very limited control that we as end users get over this data. And we very often just have to rely on the cloud providers and the application providers, and they pretty much own our data. And then we run into issues like this very well-known problem that Facebook faced in 2018, where they exposed our data from millions of profiles to a third-party firm. So if you sort of take a step back, there are a lot of challenges that CPS systems are facing, particularly as we are seeing increasing adoption. So this slide sort of summarizes them. So you have the issues of scale and centralization, which I talked about, lack of auditability, because really as end users, we have very little view into how our data is being used. And then a lot of practical problems stemming from the heterogeneity of the devices, the complex interactions of the various software and hardware components, and just basic poor implementation practices when it comes to security. So in our team, we've been kind of looking at some of these problems in a piecemeal basis. And a few years back, there was a lot of sort of hype around blockchain. And then we seriously started exploring if blockchain could potentially be one piece in the solution pie, essentially, to addressing all these problems. By no means are we saying that blockchain is the only way and the only component, but it's just one part of the puzzle, essentially. So what exactly is blockchain? So let me just give you like a 2-3 minute overview of the technology. I certainly won't have time to go deep, but just enough to sort of give you a sense of how we can use this in the context of CPS. So the origins of blockchain go back to 2008, when the notion of cryptocurrency or Bitcoin in particular came about. So there's this gentleman or lady, Satoshi Nakamoto, who we don't know. As you perhaps know, this is just a pseudonym, who proposed this brilliant idea of having a decentralized cryptocurrency. Right? And the goal he was trying to, what he was trying to do is essentially take away the middleman, take away a central point in managing the currency. Now, of course, that's easy said than done. There were a number of things that we need from a cryptocurrency. So we need mechanisms whereby someone who's claiming to own certain coins can actually prove that this individual is the one who owns those coins. The coins should only be spent once. Otherwise, you could send the coins to multiple entities essentially and fool them. And being a decentralized network, all the stakeholders need to agree on the state. And this is precisely what the Bitcoin achieves. And of course, in order to achieve that, the underlying technology is blockchain. And blockchain itself is nothing but a combination of some basic computer science concepts, right? And I'm sure all of you know these concepts, so I'll very quickly run through them. So of course, in the first instance, you need a data structure where you can have a linear organization of objects, where you have something stored at each node and then a pointer to the next entry, which essentially gives you the chain in blockchain. Next, you have the notion of asymmetric crypto or public key crypto. And this is necessary because there are instances where you want a recipient to confirm that the message was indeed sent by the claimed sender. So here you notice Alice is sending a message to Bob. Alice signs the message with her private key. When Bob receives the message, Bob applies Alice's public key, which is known to everyone, to the signature, and then Bob can confirm that this message was indeed signed by Alice and no one else could have signed it. Next, you have hash functions, which take arbitrarily length data. You run it through this cryptographically secure hash function, and it gives you a fixed length digest, essentially. And the beauty of these hash functions is that if you even change one bit in the original message and you run it through the same hash, you will get an output which doesn't match the original hash. So by this, we can actually determine if the message was altered. So this ensures message integrity. And then, of course, the fourth piece of the puzzle is the fact that we store this chain not at one central entity, but in multiple nodes, right? And of course, you then need some algorithms to ensure that there is consistency across those nodes. But for the sake of time, I'll skip all those details here. So how does the whole thing work? So very quickly, a one-slide primer on Bitcoin. Again, I use Bitcoin here in the first part of the talk because it's kind of the most popular instantiation of blockchain. So let's say Alice sends Bob some Bitcoins in a digitally signed transaction. And the way Bitcoin works is this transaction will then get broadcast to the entire network. And then certain special nodes called miners will sort of try to solve a cryptographically, sort of mathematically complex proof of work puzzle, which is very hard to solve, but very easy to confirm. And one of them will randomly win. And the winner will combine certain pending transactions into what's referred to as a block and mine this block into the blockchain and collect some fees in return for the effort. And this roughly happens every 10 minutes in Bitcoin. The new block that is now added gets sent to the entire network. So every node can now add this block into their version of the chain. Now, of course, since this runs over a distributed network, there will be instances where two nodes may mine the block roughly at the same time. And so there will be conflicts. And eventually, the way consensus works is one of those chains will win, the other will sort of die out, and you'll have some orphan blocks sitting in the blockchain. But eventually, in this instance, let's say Alice, the transaction between Alice and Bob, it will eventually get synced into the blockchain. It will sort of move forward 3-4 blocks. And at that point, we can be assured that this transaction is actually logged. This transfer has happened. And then we can be certain that essentially Alice transferred whatever Bitcoins were noted in that transaction to Bob. Now, of course, in order to use this, end users need some software, essentially some wallet software to maintain their Bitcoins and so on and so forth. Right. So this is just, mind you, a very high-level view. I've skipped over a lot of details, issues like how does the block structure actually look like. There's this concept of a Merkle tree used to store the hashes so that you can quickly check if a transaction is in a particular block. The notion of transactions, the consensus algorithms, which is kind of one of the key points. The notion of smart contracts, whereby you can sort of create programmable rules, and these rules can be actioned based on certain transactions. And the choice of the blockchain. So the Bitcoin blockchain is a public blockchain, anyone can participate. But later you'll see an example where we believe a private blockchain makes more sense, which is essentially like a restricted access blockchain where only registered users can access the blockchain. Okay, so what are the key features of blockchain? Well, the fact that once you log data in, it remains forever, gives you auditability because you can now go and sort of check the entire ledger and figure out the exact sequence in which the transactions took place. Next, you can also be sure that nothing was changed because if something is changed, then the hashes won't match, and then it's easy to detect that this happened. There's no reliance on third parties by the fact that this is a completely decentralized network, so there's no one entity who sort of has control. And since the nodes necessarily do not trust each other, the fact that they follow all these protocols helps them build trust in each other. So it's a way to sort of create distributed trust over an untrusted network. And of course, it's founded in all the state-of-the-art cryptographic protocols. So you can sort of be assured that if all those protocols are followed, nothing is sort of shady. Now, when it comes to actually applying this technology in cyber-physical systems, which is what we've been doing, we've kind of found out that there are certain dimensions you need to look at. Again, some of this will be a bit more apparent as I move forward, but things like whether you want to choose a public blockchain versus a private blockchain, right? How do you want to structure the network? Should you just have one single chain, or there's this notion of sharding or creating multiple chains? What sort of consensus protocol do you want to use? Do you want to use heavyweight protocols like proof of work, or do you want to use simpler ones like Byzantine fault tolerance? Then what sort of platform do you want to used to actually implement the solution, right? So Ethereum and Hyperledger are perhaps the two most common ones. There are certain instances where you might need to develop your own. And I'll show you in the example, in the two sort of key pieces of work that I'll present. In the first instance, we have had to build our own. And in the second instance, we've chosen to use Hyperledger. So this was our roadmap essentially, and of course it's a continuing roadmap. We're still working on this, but we started looking at this in 2016, and we've had several PhD students and postdocs working on these projects. So again, looking back, last year we wrote sort of a position paper, and we sort of put our work into context, and we saw that we have kind of been working on two things. One is sort of coming up with ways to make blockchain more suitable in the cyber-physical context. So this has to do with addressing specific challenges that CPS presents, like resource constraints, scalability, ensuring the network can manage the transaction throughput, privacy, and the issues of trust, both at the lower level and in an end-to-end manner. And then in parallel, we've also been looking at various applications, and the kind of some of these things go hand in hand because some challenges are more pertinent in one application versus another. So we've looked at sort of the smart city and smart home context, which I'll talk about first. We've looked at autonomous vehicles, energy trading, supply chains, which I'll also present. We've looked at how do you manage trading of data. And more recently, we've been looking at, say, smart construction, and then even things like managing credentials and so on and so forth. So, yeah, so again, I won't have time to go over all of this. So what I'll do is, in the first part of my talk, I'm going to talk about our first piece of work called LSB, which focuses on the smart home setting, smart home sort of smart premise setting. And here the challenges stem around getting something like complex like a blockchain to work on IoT devices. So the issues we've been looking at is scalability, throughput, trust, and so on and so forth. And the second piece of work I'll present is on our work in supply chain. So this has to do more with end-to-end trust, and will also give you a more sort of view into how do you sort of use blockchain in a sort of holistic manner in an application setting. So let me start off by talking briefly about lightweight scalable blockchain, and I'll give you a motivating example. Sort of, it's kind of a, if you may, a naive example, but still helps to get the point across. Right. So imagine you have in your home you've fitted a smart camera, and this smart camera triggers a smart lock. Right. So using me as an example, if my smart camera sees me at the door, it will recognize that it's me. It will trigger the smart lock to open the door. Right. Now, mind you, these devices may be purchased from different manufacturers. So say this is, as you see here, it's a Nest camera, so that's managed by Google. This is an August lock, so that's managed by August. Right. So these are two distinct companies, and the data is stored distinctly. So let's say my home is burglarized, right? And I find out that somehow this smart lock was open, right? So now I'm trying to figure out, was it the camera that malfunctioned, or was it the lock that malfunctioned, right? Perhaps I may even go to one of these companies and say, you are liable for this robbery, right? Because your product malfunctioned. Now, hopefully you realize that both these companies will now have a vested interest in potentially not taking liability, right? So even if, say, the camera was at fault, what's stopping the camera manufacturer to falsify some of the data? Because the data is stored with them, right? They could very easily change the data and then not bear any liability. And the same applies to the smart lock, right? So how do we trust that the data was not sort of manipulated? And that's where something like a blockchain could help, because if you had all these interactions actually logged on the blockchain, and the fact that this blockchain is not necessarily managed by company X and company Y, but it's a distributed network. So we have stronger confidence in the data that's actually logged on the blockchain, right? So anytime, say, the camera detects someone, it can actually record a transaction onto the blockchain. And anytime the door is opened, it can also log that information in the blockchain. And in fact, all interactions can be logged on the blockchain, right? So that's been our motivating sort of scenario that we pitched, that all IoT interactions could actually be logged on a blockchain. And then that gives you a very nice and transparent view into the timeline of these interactions. So this is the specific instantiation that we came up with, which we call a lightweight scalable blockchain. There's a series of papers here. If you are interested, I would recommend reading the last one in here that you see, which sort of summarizes it's our latest piece of work and sort of summarizes all of these concepts. And it's a much more solid and deeper paper. So the core idea here is we are arguing the separation of the transactions traffic and the data flow. And here by transaction traffic, we mean all the control traffic, all the interactions that take place. And in fact, you would have all these interactions even from the startup phase. So anytime you set up an IoT device, a new transaction would be logged, and so on and so forth. Now, when it comes to the device data itself, we do not recommend storing that on the blockchain, simply because that would mean the size of the blockchain will become extremely large and difficult to manage. So we recommend the IoT data is actually stored off the chain, be it in the cloud or be it in a local storage, and a hash of that data be then logged in as a transaction. To actually manage the network, we again are appreciative that the IoT devices vary in their resources. So you have devices that are extremely resource incapable, like say smart sensors, and then you have very capable devices, say like gateways or say your Alexa device or whatever, right? So given that sort of broad heterogeneity, we kind of advocate that nodes be organized as clusters, and then certain more capable nodes essentially serve as cluster heads, or what we call overlay block managers. Essentially, these are sort of the miners, if you may, in our network. And these OBMs are responsible for all the basic functionality of maintaining the blockchain. So be it verification, be it adding blocks into the blockchain, and so on and so forth. And we assume that each node is known by a public key, which is the same sort of notion as Bitcoin. And just like Bitcoin, we could change these keys repeatedly for anonymity. Now, in order to log IoT data, you do need to change the transaction vocabulary. So we have a whole sort of extensible transaction vocabulary. So you would have transactions to start the ledger of the device. So that's essentially your Genesis transaction. And then you have a variety of transactions that are sort of compatible with IoT behavior, device behavior. So storing data, request, when someone requests access for stored data, you have an access transaction. If someone is requesting real-time access to data, then you would have a monitor transaction. And the transaction flow has to be broadcast to all OBMs, because that's what's sort of being stored on the blockchain. But the resulting data, so for example, if you have one device request for access to data for another device, the actual data that flows back need not go through the blockchain. That can be actually sent along optimal routes, standard networking routes. So, of course, again, I'm not going into all the nitty-gritty. You can there are 3 key optimizations that we also propose to make this compatible. So the first one is on the consensus algorithm. So of course, by no means is this sort of extremely novel. All we are saying is we've stripped out some of the complexity that you see in heavyweight consensus protocols like proof of work, which is not necessarily needed here. I mean, There's no coins being exchanged, so there's no sort of double spending happening. So we can relax the consensus and make it sort of extremely lightweight. So here we have a simple time-based consensus where one block is generated by each node during a consensus period, assuming some random waiting time. And we do assume that neighbors actually keep an eye on each other. So if non-compliant behavior, such as generation of multiple blocks in a consensus period is observed, the neighbors would pick that up, and then they would there's a protocol outlined in the paper whereby this can be reported, and then you would sort of penalize those OBMs. To speed up the throughput and the block verification, again, normally you would want to verify all transactions in a block, but to speed things up, we include the option of only verifying a portion of the transactions. So here we use the notion of distributed trust, whereby the OBMs monitor each other's behavior, and as they see that their neighbors are behaving as expected, they build trust in each other. So you could have sort of direct trust where, say, an OBM has verified a block generated by another OBM, or you could have transitive trust, or what we call indirect evidence, where if, say, a OBM Z has verified the new block generated by X, Y can still trust the fact that Z has verified it. And so this does give Y some confidence in X, essentially. So each node could sort of maintain a table like this. This is just an example, whereby based on these prior direct evidence or prior indirect evidence, that particular OBM would only validate a certain portion of the transactions, which are randomly picked, right? So that helps us speed up the block verification process. This is particularly useful in settings where the throughput of the network is very high. Okay, so to keep up with the transaction load. We've also proposed a throughput management algorithm. Here, the goal is to adjust the throughput so that the network can sustain the number of transactions that are being created in that particular setting. So classic consensus algorithms limit the throughput. So something like Bitcoin typically limits the throughput to 7 transactions. And here, clearly, we need more. So to manage that, we actually propose an algorithm which will keep track of the current utilization, essentially the ratio of the transactions generated to the transactions appended. And as long as this ratio is between a certain advised range, things are okay. But as soon as you hit one of these edges, the algorithm kicks in and then adjusts the certain settings in the network. I'll skip the mathematical formulation here, but essentially there are 2 parameters that we use. So the first one is the consensus period. So how often are transactions blocks being added? So that's something that can be adjusted. And if this is the easier one to adjust, if this doesn't work, because again, there'll be certain limits on how small or how high the period can be decreased or increased to, then the network is refactored and we create new clusters essentially by increasing the number of miners in the network. And there's some agreement protocol that we also propose to ensure that all OBMs agree on the actions. This slide is sort of just showing you a very simple example of how the transaction flow would look like, right? So imagine there's this camera device, and imagine this has been set up to either send its data to a cloud store, or maybe there's a local store. So either of these two, doesn't matter which one. And then there's some external entity requesting access to prior data from the camera. So the way this would work in LSP is a request transaction would be broadcast into the blockchain. The OBM here would relay, because this is all broadcast, right? So the transaction would get broadcast everywhere, and eventually it would reach the particular OBM that's managing this particular camera. It would then forward the transaction to the camera. There would be certain access controls on the camera which would check that this particular requester is allowed access. And if they are, it would then go and fetch the data and send it to the requester. And at that point, as you notice, this transaction has two signatures. So in the first instance, it's only the requester that has signed it. But once the data is sent, the data provider also signs it, and a transaction gets logged. So at this point, we do have a record in the blockchain that so-and-so entity accessed this particular data from this particular camera. Now, we have tested this fairly extensively. I won't present you all the results again for the sake of time. I'll just quickly show you maybe one graph here. At that time, this was a simulation. Since then, we have developed a full-fledged working implementation on Raspberry Pi capable devices. I just haven't had time to generate nice-looking graphs from that implementation. In any case, so this picture is showing you how the distributed trust idea works, right? So what we are doing here is we have a 50-node network with 13 OBMs, and there's a certain transaction rate at which transactions are generated. And the x-axis is showing you the number of blocks that are logged into the blockchain. The bars show you the time taken to mine each of those blocks, essentially verify the transactions within the block. And there's this second y-axis here, which shows you the percentage of the transactions that are actually validated. So this is showing you the impact of only checking a certain fraction of transactions within the block. And as you may expect, as the nodes build confidence in each other, and as they slowly start reducing increasing the trust, the number of transactions that are checked starts to reduce, and this speeds up the processing. So here, for example, initially, since the nodes do not have trust in each other, all transactions are checked within each block. And so the processing time is fairly high. And then as time increases, you'll notice that the number of the percent of transactions that are checked keeps reducing. Right? So compared to, say, a baseline where all transactions are always checked, our scheme always will achieve a lower delay because we're only checking a fraction of transactions. Now, you might think since only a fraction of transactions are checked, it might be possible to log in fake transactions. And certainly under certain circumstances, that will happen. But what we argue is if you can structure the network correctly so that you have sufficient number of block managers actually checking these transactions, the likelihood of a bad transaction actually being logged is very low. So that's actually being shown on this graph. Since I'm running a bit long, I'll actually skip these two because I do want to spend some time on the second part of the talk, which is going to focus on supply chain. So I'll pivot now. I was talking about sort of a smart home IoT setting. Let's now move to supply chains. And we'll use food supply chains as an example, but these concepts could also be applied to any other supply chains. And there's the reason we use food is because there's increasing need for transparency in food supply chains. And this is evident from a lot of consumers demanding to know where their food is coming from and various other problems arising. So things like counterfeiting of premium goods is a known problem. Disease outbreaks through contamination is a known problem. And it often takes a lot of time to trace back where the origin of that food was and then to take appropriate action. And then you have some bizarre instances, like a couple of years back here in Australia, people started finding needles inside strawberries. So some malicious people had actually embedded needles in strawberries. And this created a huge problem because people just stopped buying strawberries. And it actually took a lot of time to figure out where the problem was. So all of this points to an increasing need to have a clear view of where the food products are grown, how they're actually transported. And if you look at most typical supply chains, right, this is sort of a good representation of what a supply chain looks like. You have some primary producers sourcing the raw materials, which get sold to a supplier who then passes it on to a manufacturer, which gets put onto the distribution chain and then ends up on the retail shelf and then finally picked up by the consumer, right? So we need a way to sort of track all the data about these products as they move through these different entities. And clearly, while these entities do have certain business relationships with each other, they may not necessarily trust each other completely, right? And they may not be willing to share their data. And in fact, most of this data is anyway siloed with them. So it's very hard to get a complete picture. Essentially, what we want to do is we want to create a product story, as we call it. And that's where blockchains can be very useful. They can help you figure out the origins of the raw materials as long as they've been recorded appropriately. All the handover of the physical items from, say, one supply chain entity to another can all be logged onto the blockchain. If you have IoT sensors embedded along that particular supply chain, say from the farm to the trucks that are moving them and so on and so forth, or say even the factory floor where products are processed, you can have all that data stored in the blockchain. And you could also write smart contracts which will take all that data and run various sort of hazard checks to make sure the products are meeting all the compliance rules. And then finally, customers can sort of get a sense of the product story. And if need be, you could also use all of this data to investigate any outbreaks from contamination. So a couple of years back, we proposed this framework called ProductChain. And in this context, given that this network does not need to be necessarily open to everyone, we argue for what's called a permissioned architecture, where certain known entities who are registered are allowed access to the blockchain. And again, those access rights are also well controlled. So all of this sort of access logic is determined by a governing body, essentially, which is appointed to decide how the access to the blockchain will be monitored. Then we also have extended a transaction vocabulary, which sort of is more amenable to all the supply chain operations. And each participant plays a well-defined role, and only certain participants can create certain types of transactions. Next, since such supply chains could have global reach, you might have issues where you might have to address the scalability of the network because the transaction load becomes very high. So for that, we propose the use of sharding, or essentially creating side chains, which may be apportioned according to the geographical regions. And then, of course, protecting trade flows is very important. So as I hinted earlier, we do have some strict access control mechanisms on who can read and write to the ledger. So these pictures are sort of just depicting what I said right now. So here you have essentially a permission ledger managed by a blockchain technology vendor. There's a governing board, which typically consists of, say, a food control organization, maybe some government organization, who agree and decide some rules, which will then be manifested using an access control list and then implemented by the technology vendor onto the blockchain. The participants are entities like the supplier, the producer, the retailer, the logistics company, and say the manufacturer. And then the consumer is a non-participating member who can only read certain things, because consumers don't necessarily need to write things into the ledger. Right? And this is sort of showing you the tiered network architecture that we propose. So at the top, we have like a product ledger that's global, that has global view. And then here we have side chains, which could be sort of organized based on geographical regions. And then the participants sort of attach themselves to send data to each of a particular side chain. This shows you the vocabulary that we've created. So we have certain specific types of transactions that match specific actions on the supply chain. So say when a primary producer creates the raw material, essentially sources the raw material, it logs what's called a create transaction. And then as the item makes its way in various forms across the supply chain entities, we have transfer transactions. Now, since two entities are involved here, these transactions are signed by both. Say a create transaction only needs to be signed by the producer. And then there's another third unique transaction called a production transaction, particularly for items that need manufacturing. So here you might have multiple ingredients being sourced and combined together to create a final product. And that's where you might need to link up this sort of product back to multiple ingredients. So that's all done through the production transaction. I'll skip the part about validation for the sake of time, but essentially, again, here you don't need something complex like proof of work. So we've kind of relied on a lottery-based consensus algorithm. And this is showing you a nice pictorial depiction of how the provenance information could be obtained, right? So imagine you buy a chocolate bar and you want to know where the milk and cocoa was sourced from. So as a consumer, you could scan the QR code, which would generate a query that gets sent to this global ledger. It will then pull out the specific information that a consumer can see. So things like, say, where the cocoa was sourced from. So the location maybe of Bob's farm, and say the location of George's cocoa farm, and so on and so forth. And you may also get some information about how the product was actually transferred from the origin to the retailer's shelf. So when we did this first piece of work, a lot of people started asking us, okay, this is all good, right? So you get data, you log it into the blockchain, you're assured that the data is not being changed. You're assured of traceability because you can link it all back. But how do you know that the data itself is trustworthy, right? Because remember, in that particular example, we are recording a sort of digital representation of a physical event, right? So someone sources the cocoa. That's actually a physical event that's being captured as a digital transaction. So there is a bit of disconnect there in that. How do you make sure that record is itself good? Because if you log in bad data into the blockchain, then all you get is you're storing, essentially, you're guaranteeing traceability and integrity of bad data, right? So there needs to be ways whereby you can have a stronger trust in the data that's itself being logged into the blockchain. So that led us to this second piece of work, whereby we proposed a reputation and trust framework that can be integrated with, say, supply chains. Our work also extends to other forms of trust, but I'll skip that. I'll stick to that previous example here. So what we propose here is a very flexible and granular framework, which allows us to compute the reputation of different entities that participate in the supply chain at different levels of abstraction. Essentially, you could get the reputation of a particular supply chain entity, and you could even find out how reputed this entity has been in the context of the moving across one particular product. You could, of course, also get the some sense of the quality of the product itself. We also rely on multiple observations. As you see here, in order to ascertain confidence in the data, we make use of sort of IoT sensor streams. We make use of feedback that each of these entities sort of convey. So if you look at any, as your product moves across, right, each handover involves essentially one seller and one buyer. So in each transaction, you could have a reputation being assigned to the seller of that particular product. So that can get logged. And you could also have some regulatory endorsements that happen, of course, less frequently, but still they do happen. And then we actually developed a proof of concept of this in Hyperledger, and we demonstrate that the overheads are minimal. So I'll just spend maybe a couple more minutes on this, and then I'll conclude. So here at the lowest layer, we have all the data observations. So all the IoT sensor streams, essentially all the bio ratings in each trade event, and any inputs that you get from the regulatory bodies. So all of these are essentially logged as transactions. And again, we've extended the transaction vocabulary to account for all this information. Now, the blockchain layer in this 3-layer architecture is the most sort of the heart of the system, if you may. So this is where all the data gets logged. All of this data gets stored as transactions in the ledger. But we also have a bunch of smart contracts that are taking all this information as input and then processing that to do for various endpoints. So essentially, you could have a smart contract that's monitoring the quality of the product, and you could have a smart contract that's monitoring the reputation of the various entities. So we assume that there are certain digital profiles created for these entities and commodities, which are also stored on the blockchain, and these smart contracts would feed into a reputation and trust module that computes a reputation score and say a trust score for these entities, which is then stored in their sort of digital profile. Now, again, here we need to be careful of who can read what, who can write what. So as before, there's an extended access control list, which sort of oversees who can do what on the blockchain. This shows you some of the smart contracts you could have. So for example, the sensor data could all be feeding into a quality contract, and you could set up, say, warnings on the sensor data. So in this picture, we are showing you temperature data, but it could be any sensor really. So say in this case, the product was supposed to be moved across at a cold temperature, but you could create a contract whereby if the temperature exceeds a certain range, it could create warnings to be sent to the responsible entities. And at the same time, the quality contract could also generate a rating for the commodity itself. So that gets added to the commodity profile. And then if you look at the seller's profile, here you notice there are 3 inputs coming in. So one is, of course, the input from the, this is all, by the way, controlled by the rating contract. So you have the commodity rating that's also accounted here. You have the feedback that's coming in from the buyer, and you also have feedback coming in from the regulator. So all of that is sort of weighted based on certain weightings you might take into account, and you get a reputation for the seller. And this here is the reputation for the actual commodity itself. I'll skip this last slide here. And finally, at the top, you have the application layer, which allows the entities such as the administrators, the regulators, and even the consumers to query all this information in a meaningful manner. So you could have queries coming in for, say, computing the trust rating for the various entities, certain properties you might request for the commodities or the traders. And you could also action certain rewards and penalties based on the profiles that are created. We did implement a proof of concept of this in Hyperledger Composer 2 at that time. And we've benchmarked the performance here. Again, I won't go into too much detail here. All this is sort of to demonstrate that the framework that we've developed is fairly lightweight. So what we do here is we benchmark our framework against a blockchain solution which does not incorporate all the trust and reputation frameworks, right? So this is our baseline, which is just doing the basic stuff. And here we have the TrustChain framework. So this is showing you, for example, the latency to log the trade transactions as a function of the transaction rate. So you see there's very minimal overhead that we introduced. And similarly, when it comes to throughput, our throughput almost is again very close to, say, a baseline. So all this is sort of suggesting is our framework is lightweight. It's not imposing too much overheads. Yeah, so that sort of hopefully gives you two different views of how you could use blockchains in two different cyber-physical system settings. As I said, we've done a lot more work, but clearly I wouldn't have time to sort of compress all that here. I'll leave you with some open issues. So by all means, we've not solved all the problems. I mean, we've just scratched the surface, if you may. So there's a lot of work to be done. I mean, issues like privacy, trust, incentives, all of these need much deeper thoughts, much deeper explorations. Most of our work, again, makes some fairly simplified assumptions. So as we move forward, we need to look at more realistic system models. Finding good data sets has been a big challenge. Even developing POCs is a challenge. I mean, certainly you can do a small POC, but how do you scale it up, right? I mean, certainly in a lab setting, it's hard to recreate what a global supply chain would look like, for example. Right? So how do we actually do that in a more systematic manner? Still remains a challenge. Similarly, testing platforms are again limited. I mean, sure, with Hyperledger, you do get all the Caliper functionalities, but what if you're not using Hyperledger, right? For example, something like the LSB work, testing that in a more large-scale setting is extremely challenging. Then, of course, you have the interaction of all the data that's logged in the blockchain, the smart contracts and machine learning. So that's some very interesting sort of intersection that's worth exploring. And then there's a lot to be done in standardization, governance, policy, and so on and so forth. If you allow me, I'll just do a couple of shameless plugs. So we have a book coming out at the end of this month. So this has been a labor of love, if you may, with my colleagues Ali and Raja. We are releasing a book on blockchain for cyber-physical systems. So this will elaborate a lot deeper on some of the things I've discussed in this talk. So if you're interested, you can certainly avail of this generous discount. And finally, if things do return to normal, we are hoping to have a physical conference next year in Sydney. So this is a new conference, but it's emerged to be one of the premier conferences on blockchain and cryptocurrency. So this will take place in May. Hopefully physically, if not virtually. So if you're interested, do keep an eye on the deadlines. The deadlines are still a few months away in December. So that's all I have to say. Hopefully I didn't go much longer than what you had planned for. Do reach out if you have any questions. I mean, I'm happy to take questions now, but certainly happy to also engage offline. So yeah, I think I'll stop now. Thanks for your attention.
Thank you so much for the informative session, sir. On behalf of Computer Science and Engineering Department, and also on behalf of me, I wholeheartedly thank you for taking part in this national workshop, sir. Thank you so much, sir.
So thank you so much for accepting our invitation, and it was really wonderful session,
So
sir.
this is about the first session of day 1. We will be having session 2 today afternoon at 2 o'clock. We will be having a session on how to write a good system research paper by Dr. Sandeep Chakrabarty. So meet you all at 2 o'clock. Thank you. Kindly fill the feedback form, and the link will be enabled only 1 hour from now.
So thank you, sir. Thank you so much, sir.
Thank you all for taking part in this session. So meet you all in the next session. Thank you.